up a bit. So the next speaker is Chris Oliver. If you've looked for any information on the web regarding Rails, you have probably run across his website, gorails.com. He's a great screencast and education site. So without further ado, we'll bring up Chris.
So I'm going to be talking about Rails in the stack, but as he mentioned, the stack is quite a large thing. And Rails actually likes to put its fingers in quite a few of those pieces of the stack. So as mentioned, I run a site called GoRails, do a weekly screencast on Rails, all the different aspects of that it dives into, like caching, performance, but just new features of Rails that are coming out. So what is the stack? The stack is something you hear referred to all the time. It's really the sort of like layers that are required to build a web application. So at the very bottom layer, you have things like your servers, DNS, all the domains, like lower level stuff that you don't tend to interact with that much. And then on top of that, when you're building your application, you have your database. It's where all your data is stored. Then you build your application on top of that. And then the client side is typically the browser, runs on your phone, your tablet, computer. And that's typically the client side of all of this. So Rails generally focuses on the back end, but it has opinions about pretty much every layer of that, including client side and database structure and all of that stuff. So one of the JavaScript and CSS tooling things is that you have to write your JavaScript and CSS, you have to serve it up. That's the responsibility of the application to determine, should we gzip it, should we compress it all into a single file, should we serve up multiple files. So Rails cares about those things because it takes a very holistic approach to building web applications. And that's kind of like the core philosophy of Rails. It's for building server-side stuff, but there's so many aspects of that Rails likes to have its word on. So one of the core features of Rails is really Active Record. It's your database, helps you define your data and its relationships and associations. So it's pretty simple. You run generally Postgres as your database. You define your tables, you have users, they have names, emails, passwords. They might have, for example, users might have projects, so you can set up the association so that easily you can reference between tables. It can handle all the complicated SQL that you'd have to write, and it helps you just kind of worry about your application from your perspective. You don't really care so much about how the SQL needs to be written most of the time. You're building, excuse me, you're building your application from the perspective of a business generally, which has your goals as your business. You're trying to help people accomplish some goal. So Rails has the direction of kind of how do we help you focus on that logic and kind of wrap up everything else so you don't have to worry about it too much. So Active Record helps you on the database level, but that's fairly straightforward. However, when it comes to building a real application, imagine your YouTube where a user uploads a video file. You actually have to go show them that, hey, we have to process this video because this takes time. Then we have to start transcoding that video. So we have to do things like, we take this video, you gave us an MP4, we need to convert that to formats that the browser can use, the phone can use, whatever you're building. Then we also need to send out lots of email notifications to your subscribers or whatever. So Action Controller in Rails is designed to guide you on that path of basically saying, here's what we need to accomplish. Let's issue commands to kind of go and do those pieces of work, and we'll organize that based on our controllers. So then once you've done all that, you have to present the user with something to interact with. So that's your HTML. Sometimes if you're doing mobile APIs, you're building JSON endpoints. So you have to have different ways of interacting and viewing that data. So your views help you generate CSVs, HTML, PDFs, you name it, and Rails kind of helps you, it helps you define all of those aspects of your application in fairly standardized ways, because these are all pretty standard things that just about every application ends up building at some point. So when I talked about that Rails has influence on the front end, there's a lot of times where you're using a new version of JavaScript that needs to be transpiled to the current version, or you're using CoffeeScript or Sass in order to make working with your front end code a lot simpler. Rails has built the asset pipeline in order to take the code that you write for the front end, convert it to regular JavaScript and CSS that your browser can interpret and actually run. So that allows you to use features of these languages that don't actually come with your browser. So then every application has emails at some point. If you allow your users to log in, you're going to have forgot your password emails, you're going to have notifications, all those types of things. Rails provides Action Mailer, which allows you to connect to SMTP servers to send emails, and that's all kind of built in the core of Rails. That, sending emails, talking to SMTP servers, you have to open up a new connection to another server. You have to tell it, hey, I want to send this email with this text to this person, and I want to do that to 1,000 different people. It's a lot of work, and if you don't offload that into the background, that's going to slow your web app down significantly. So Active Job is a feature of Rails that has come out recently that builds into Rails the core functionality of doing work in the background. So you can power this by things like Sidekick, which you see here on the right. And that basically is tooling to allow you to do work in the background, like transcoding those videos, sending emails. And Rails takes a holistic approach to all of this because it has influences in saying, well, pretty much every application we see these days needs to do some work in the background, so let's automatically include that with our framework and ship that as a standard feature. So front-end code, though, is one thing that Rails has focused on a little bit, but not significantly. And more recently, they've decided to dive into shipping turbolinks by default, which is a front-end library to help improve front-end performance. Now, it's a lot different than Angular, Ember, or React in that it's very lightweight, and basically it strips out some of the standard stuff that your browser has to do every time that it loads a page. So when you open a page up in your browser, you have to grab the document, you have to look for all the images in there, you have to load the CSS, load the JavaScript, you have to parse all that, and you have to paint the page with that information. And turbolinks makes it so that when you click a new link, the browser doesn't have to do all of that every single time. It can skip the steps of downloading and parsing and executing the CSS and JavaScript. So this actually is a super important feature of Rails that has kind of been less talked about lately, but it's becoming more important now as Turbolink adapters are coming out. So Basecamp is the company that built Rails, and they've actually got like a team of 10 or 15 developers, and it's not very many, but they're supporting a very large application in which they use turbolinks to build desktop, your typical browser-based application. But they also use turbolinks in order to build their mobile apps. They're hybrid apps that have a website embedded in them. But when you click on some of these links, they actually go to native Swift code or native Android code, so that when you click on like the edit link, it might show you a native view so you can have a better experience on mobile. but their Android and iOS developers have significantly less to do because they're sharing the exact same UI and content from the main page. So they're experiencing the site pretty much the same way, except they're hooking into those pieces that are better suited for native code. And it saves you a lot of trouble from using, if you were to use a framework like Cordova or PhoneGap or whatever, those hybrid apps are kind of painful to use because they don't allow you to do quite the seamless integration between native code and your web application. In Rails 5, which hopefully comes out in the next month or so, they are adding in WebSockets. So most applications these days in the past they haven't needed real-time communication. Even Campfire, the typical example of a web-based chat system, was just asking the server every 3 seconds if there was any new messages. So it was faking being real-time. And that kind of has gone away. And WebSockets have come to replace that. And Action Cable is being built into Rails now going forward. So Action Cable is going to allow you to have real-time communication between your users and the server and even other users. So for example, you can build pretty easily a real-time chess application that allows you to, when you load the page, it creates a persistent connection to the server and allows another person to create a persistent connection. And then the second that this person on the left moves, you'll see it update over here because it's happening in real time, and they're both connected to the server live. So rather than the polling, you won't have to wait 3 seconds for that to show up. So as web apps get more complex, over time, Rails has this philosophy of basically whatever we see happening more and more and more, we'll just kind of roll it into the framework, give you some pretty standard ways of interacting with this stuff, which can be good and bad. They standardize a lot of it, so it's easy to get started with it. But of course, at scale, building more complex apps, you need to take advantage of specific features of a lot of these things. So it can be a problem at times that you'll have to break out of Rails a little bit and interact directly with your WebSockets or whatever. But Rails is kind of designed with the philosophy of let's make really, really efficient small teams build web applications that handle pretty much the gamut of what you typically need to ship with most applications. You CSV downloads, you have real-time notifications, that sort of thing. And it's kind of Rails takes a philosophical approach to the framework as opposed to we'll focus on a single piece. They think about pretty much everything they can, from the very low level of compressing and compiling all your JavaScript files into one, because that's faster, all the way up to real-time WebSockets. So that's it.